So it's great to see so many familiar faces, but also so many new faces here today. My name is John McCullough, and I'm the Director of Creative Manchester. And as some of you here will know, Creative Manchester is the University of Manchester's platform for bringing together interdisciplinary researchers on projects which involve creative practice or partnership with many of the brilliant cultural organisations who are represented here today. And we're really delighted to be doing this in the Martin Harris Centre, which is one part of the university's cultural portfolio, and alongside Whitworth Art Gallery, the Manchester Museum, the Rylands and Jodrell Bank, all of whose leaders and directors have looked at what the art centres are doing to learn about best practice and how we can be involved in this region's activity. I'm going to introduce our four speakers now, and I'm going to hand over to them to take you through their presentations, and there are going to be there's going to be time for questions and for conversation at the end as well. Dave Moutrey, OBE, is an honorary research fellow here at the University of Manchester. He is Director of Culture and Creative Industry for Manchester City Council. And so he has led on the creation and the delivery of the culture and creative industries policy and strategy, working closely with the industrial sector. Dave's long involvement with art centres, though, it speaks especially to his time as director and chief executive at Home, which, as you all know, is a purpose-built multi-art form venue that opened unbelievably 10 years ago already. Does it feel like 10 years, Dave? No. Dave was awarded an OBE for his services to culture in 2022 and a doctorate from the University of Salford in 2018. In February 22, he was appointed by the Secretary of State at DCMS as chair of the Theatres Trust. Dave will be followed today by Gavin Barlow. We're delighted Gavin has travelled up to speak today as well. And of course, Future Art Centres are one of the sponsors of today's event as well. Gavin is co-director of Future Art Centres, which has more than 160 venue members across the UK, and he has led that network since it was founded in 2013. He has been Chief Executive and Artistic Director of the Albany in Deptford, South East London for the last 20 years, overseeing a significant transformation of the scale and work of the organisation in an area, of course, that has changed so much over those decades as well. He's Chair of the Lewisham Cultural Partnership, and he's a Strategic Advisor on Culture to the Lewisham Council. Ray Morrison is a doctoral researcher at the University of Sheffield, whose work is funded by the ESRC. Their research uses quantitative methods to investigate mechanisms that reproduce inequalities in arts labour, exploring how expectations placed on workers conflict with the sector's commitment to equality and diversity. They've previously worked in peace campaigning organisations and most recently at the national charity Sound and Music. Dr. Jennifer Cleary, our final speaker, joined Arts Council England in April 2021 and leads on its work in combined arts nationally. Before joining Arts Council England, Jen was Director of Creative Engagement at Manchester International Festival, leading strategic programmes of participatory commissioning and producing artist development, education and engagement, talent development and fundraising. Jen sits on the Internationalisation and Marketing Advisory Board here at Manchester, at Manchester GMCA, and as well as her PhD in medical microbiology, which I feel is always worth mentioning in a context like this, and she also has a professional certificate in executive coaching. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dave, who's going to start us off.
Hello. I should start off by saying, yes, my name is Dave Moutrey, pronouns he, him, and audio description, I'm a tall white man with a white beard, blue glasses and a bald head, which makes me perfect for working in the arts, I think. John mentioned my day job as Director of Culture and Creative Industries for Manchester City Council. I need to be very clear that I'm not speaking in that capacity today. I'm speaking as an honorary research fellow at the University of Manchester. So all the views expressed are my own and not the City Council's. I just thought it's important to mention that. I've worked for a long time in art centres, over 40 years. apart from 7 years where I crossed over to the dark side and worked in arts marketing. And most of those times were spent working in an art centre. What I'm not is an academic, and that'll become plainly obvious to you. And that's why I'm finding today quite intimidating, because there's some friends of mine in here who are academics, and they think, so here we go. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to, I'm going to say a few words, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ray Morrison, who's going to talk about their work, looking at the data and some of the challenges that's presenting. Then we're going to get a response from Gavin around from Future Arts Centre's point of view. Then Jen Cleary is going to talk about from an Arts Council point of view. Then we'll have a bit of Q&A between the panel, but also with you. So if you've got questions, ideas, comments, observations, please do. This is a whole new experience to me. I've been working on my book proposal, and I've had the publishers have had readers looking at my proposal, and the feedback's been incredible, really, really useful. So that open dialogue, I think, is massively beneficial, certainly to me and the research that I'm going through. So, you know, please feel free to join in there. So, the research project. I'm looking at effectively what an art centre is and how they're developed. I'm looking at the impact that they've had on audiences, artists, and place, and then looking at the future. I use this photograph here specifically. I'm glad I did, because I didn't know Mary Cloak was coming. But it's Blue Coat in Liverpool, the first art centre in the UK, allegedly. We'll see what that looks like. The origin story for this is that I was working on an exhibition at home, and we went in search of books around art centres, and we found two. This one, called Art Centres by John Lane, subtitle Every Town Should Have One, and then there's that one, John Lane. And then this one about Blue Coat in Liverpool. I've subsequently found a couple more, but there's not many. There's lots of references to the work of art centres in cultural theory documents, etc. But it felt like it was time to add to the canon. And one of the things you'll realise in this is that it's probably just as well I'm not claiming to be academic, because I'm not a neutral voice in this. I'm passionate about art centres. I think they're really important. I think they do good work. So when I'm doing my interviews with people going around the country, I say, remember, I'm not the BBC. Mind you, are the BBC neutral? Who knows? Anyway, but I'm coming from this, from the point of view that I care deeply about what art centres do. So the research is going through a number of phases, and I'm coming to the end of phase 1 at the moment. I've already interviewed well over 40 art centre leaders and some stakeholders and thinkers around the sector. I've started the literature search, but I've got more to do. Ray and I have been working together on data, and we've got a long way to go with that yet. I've done a lot of site visits. Side of this is that I go to Shetland and Orkney on Saturday just to go and visit some art centres. How nice is that, eh? And then phase 2, we've got more in-depth interviews. We need to work with audience development experts and placemaking experts to find out a bit more about that, and also with artists. Artists are really quite critical in this conversation, but the sort of agenda setting has come out of the work that I've done already with art centre leaders. More data analysis, more site visits, and then start sharing draft findings. And I think if John's okay, we'll probably do another one of these later on in the year to share where we've got to. And then reviewing the evidence, shaping the narrative, etc., etc. I'm planning to do some podcasts, if I can make it all work, around the findings. So the stuff that's coming out of the work so far is what's an art centre? Now, this is going to be a challenge throughout this entire project. What is an art centre? And I think I'm going to come to a view, but whether it's definitive or not is anybody's guess. But I think the thing about multiple art forms, championing collaborative creation, deeply embedded in local life, and build around an ethos, inclusivity and experiment, seems to be things that are coming out of this at the moment. And interestingly, in this book, there's a guy called Peter Stark who set up Suttle Park, or started setting up Suttle Park. He went on to be head of Arts Council, Northern Arts Board, who I interviewed last week, actually. And there were 6 principles of an art centre in this book, and this sort of hold true today. interestingly, and is also coming out of this. And you know, we'll see where we go with that. The relationship with the purpose of an arts centre, this is not one of the questions I've mentioned, but the purpose of arts centres, again, seems to be around fostering creativity and experimentation, serving as a community anchor, supporting multiple art forms under one roof, championing inclusivity and cultural democracy. That's a big feature at the moment, I think. But always has been. And some of that sort of relates back to the roots of art centres in the community arts movement and the arts lab movement. They're very interesting in all of that. Areas which I'm just starting to get under the bonnet of now. Catalysing social impact and civic value, connecting global and local, but also making good art. It's really important. And this is one of the things that's going to be a challenge in the narrative about art centres. Impact on arts, on audiences. I think the bottom line is that all the art centres I've spoken to, and certainly the feedback I'm getting, is that deep-rooted relationship with place it tends to be fundamental. That's not to say theatres don't have a close relationship with place, or art galleries do, but there's something really particular about art centres and the way that they relate to place that I've really got to get my head around more and understand more as the research develops. Artists, the impact on artists is, again, really important. There's something about being able to develop your practice in a space that's more open to working across art forms, in multi-art form place, that's important. And there's also something about, because most art centres are not right up there in the public glaze, or for reviews, etc., which actually I think is a shame. But nevertheless, that's the thing. It means you can develop your ideas, and you've got the opportunity to get it wrong, and to improve much more than you do in other places. And there's a lot of pioneering and development of practice with artists in art centres that has been co-opted by theatres, galleries, museums, concert halls, etc. It's a sort of an R&D engine. And again, that comes out of its relationship with the community arts sector, with the arts labs, etc. Nearly finished. Get into the interesting stuff soon. Impact on place. The impact on place really is about this responsiveness to local voices, and building sustained relationships and partnerships. One of the real joys of this project was spending some time out at Story House in Chester. The relationship there between those people who use that building and the work that goes on there is astonishing. And it all goes back to its origin story and how it was designed and where it came from, and the roots into that community. And I think there's lots of good examples about that in practice across the UK. So we are going to talk about the challenge of data. Because I'm not an expert, I came up with a set of questions here. Now you'll be thinking, oh, let's just look at Arts Council data. We'll get the answers to these. No, we won't. The work with Ray has been really interesting, and starting to, what we've done more than anything is to scope out what the challenge is. So these are questions that I want to answer in some way, shape, or form, and how this underpins the narrative of a local hero. The title from a book, the working title, is A Local Hero, The Quiet Rise of Art Centres. And there's a bit on the end which might come off, but, and how they relate to local communities or something. But that thing, maybe I've just had a chip on my shoulder for 40 years, but I've always felt the work that we've done in art centres has never been valued quite the same by whoever the establishment is, than perhaps theatres or concert halls, etc. And it's not to say it hasn't been doing good, the organisations have been doing good work. There's something about value. I don't know whether I can demonstrate that yet. That might just be my chip on the shoulder, and maybe I just need to get over myself. But the research is a really interesting journey to find where I'm up to on that. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Ray Morrison, who's going to talk about their work looking at the data. Thank you.
I'm Ray, hello, my pronouns are they or she, and audio description, I'm short, white person with blonde hair, dressed all in black. Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was very good. It went very fast, actually. This is what I'm going to run through in the next 20 minutes. Yeah, as Dave said, I'm just going to give an overview of the findings that we have so far. So far, I've only, I guess we've been doing this together for, I guess we've been chatting for maybe a month or two, but I've only really done like a week of work on it. So we've just got some initial findings to present. And then it'd be really interesting to hear from you and discuss our next steps a bit further. So just firstly, an introduction was given to me already, but I thought I'd just share a picture of Mablethorpe Beach, which is where I'm from because it's nice. I guess when I do presentations, kind of sometimes want to talk about that because Mablethorpe is sometimes one of the places that's like on the sort of underserved lists, but does have lots of really nice things within it. Okay, let me get on to talking about the data that I've been doing so far. So basically, Dave had written this book proposal, which was very good, and had on it a list of, I think, about 150-ish art centres. I think that was compiled like from you and also with future art centres. And yeah, basically gave me this list and said, here's all these questions, can you find out the answers? So here's me on the computer trying to find out. So basically, we were looking first at England. So we are going to look at Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland, but for now we're just looking at England. And I basically like cross-referenced this list with like the Charity Commission, because a lot of the Charity Commission, like on the Charity Commission, they've got quite a lot of information about finances and people employed and stuff like that. So from the big list, there were 102 that were on the Charity Commission website. So I just made like a script to kind of web scrape all of the information from that. And that's what's gone into the figures about finances and employees and volunteers. Then we wanted to find out about audiences. I did cross-reference that list that I had with the NPO data set. But there were only, I think there were like 50 that were also on the NPO data set from this 102. But it wasn't, not all of the information was kind of exactly useful for answering these research questions. And also, I guess there's something about whether organizations are NPOs or not. Like, do we just only want to look at the ones that are NPOs, or do we want to look at art centres that are also not NPOs? So yeah, my project partner for my PhD is the audience agency, and I just happened to be meeting the guy from there, and I asked if I could have their data, and so they gave me the data set for 2024, and there was 23 organizations from our big list that were also in this 2024 data set. And it just kind of, looking at it from this angle, which we'll see like a bit later, just kind of allowed us to look at these different demographic profiles, like cultural, like segments that the audience agency have, which was just quite useful for these purposes. But yeah, it's only really initial findings. Obviously, this sample of 23 is very small, and not the findings from that like aren't generalizable for art centres in general. But yeah, I'll come into that in a bit. And also, when I was doing this, looking at the audiences, we did a comparison with theatres, and Dave came up with kind of 23 comparable theatres, like looking at it from like income, by income, total income. And that's how that was decided. Here's a picture of one. So the initial findings from who is working in art centres. So we have 4,120 employees, 4,613 volunteers, and 878 trustees. So that actually means that there's basically many more people volunteering their time each year than there are working in art centres. And again, all this information is just from what people have registered on the Charity Commission. In terms of finances, again, from the Charity Commission, if we look first at like the second figure, I should have actually figured out how to say that. A very large amount of total income. So that's the total income, and this is the total government income. And basically, we were just looking at, we wanted to work out, like, for every £1 of public funding, how much is like generated from other sources. Yeah. You know, the US and the UK actually call billion a different thing. But anyway, and so for every £1 of public funding, the sector is generating £4.66 from other sources. Now, if we look at the audience segmentation, are many people familiar with audience agency, audience spectrum? Yeah. So I'm not going to have the time to kind of go onto all these different segments, but basically this kind of like semicircle on the right is from the audience agency, and you may be able to see like on the left-hand side on the red, it's kind of saying higher engaged, and then on the other side it's saying lower engaged. So we didn't have demographic information available from this data set, we just had this. So basically the kind of from the metro culturals is what the audience agency is saying is like the most highly engaged group, and then down to like supportive communities is the most like the least engaged group in their kind of audience segmentation. And then there's like all these other ones in the middle. It's kind of, I think if you went on the website, probably be good to like look at it very specifically, like if you want any more information about how they kind of categorize these different people. But maybe in the future, having some demographic information would also be useful. And these are the initial findings about these 23 art centres that were also in the audience agency's data set. So I kind of like have to go back maybe to help see, but the largest percentage audience share was dormitory dependables. So they are kind of here in the second row, in the middle section of the most engaged. Then we do have commuterland culture buffs, who are within the more highly engaged group. And then trips and treats, home and heritage and experience seekers, again, kind of like all around like the middle. And then below, not really that dissimilar, I think, to other, like from these initial findings, I didn't really find there was some, like, it wasn't that different to other art forms, basically, or other types of organisation. Upholstery, like basically the ones that are at the bottom are kind of as to be expected, being reached like the least by art centres, because these are the ones that in general are kind of like least engaged across the arts in general. Then with the, you kind of can't see the top, this is a comparison with theatres. So with those 23 organisations that Dave had given me, like the 23 theatres, I just did a quick comparison between the audiences for those and then the audiences for the art centres that we have. So this, again, it's only a few, so it's not generalisable, but just gives an initial idea. And I don't think from these that we see a really specific pattern so far. So for example, like the commuterland culture buffs are amongst the most highly engaged, and they seem to be more represented within art centres, whereas the metro culturals, which are also like highly engaged, are like much less. So I found from this that I just didn't see a very specific pattern. We see like frontline families being more represented within art centres, but then kaleidoscope creativity, like both of those being like less engaged and being less represented. So yeah, I feel like from this so far, we're not seeing like very clear patterns, but again, maybe that's just because of the limitations of the data. And then I also did a finance comparison with the theatres, also using information from the Charity Commission. From that, I found like I looked at what the finances were for each, for all the organisations, and then also looked at from the audience agency what the total tickets were like for that year. So public cost per head for art centres came out as £9.91. The theatres came out as £11.16. So that is showing a higher public cost per head for theatres in 2024 at least. But yeah, mostly let's talk about the limitations of this. The small sample size, I think, just does make it quite difficult. And basically, it was really nice to get all these questions and just try and find out the answers, but actually finding out all these like different, basically putting all these different data sets together, it's fine and it's okay, but it just means that there's like kind of not that much consistency across the different organizations. So even when comparing, for example, on the Charity Commission, I don't think everyone is kind of reporting everything in exactly the same way, even though that should be kind of the most like legit way of doing it. And then when we get into like audiences, then it becomes like even more difficult. So yeah, from this, and also, yeah, we don't have too much information so far about artists. In the MPO data set, there is stuff about employed artists, but when I was talking with Future Art Centres about it, we were just saying we're not sure that actually the extent of the work that organisations do with artists is always captured in the surveys, because I think often the last thing on people's, as someone who had to fill out an MPO thing, sometimes the last thing on your mind is filling it out. You just kind of end up doing other work. But even though there are limitations, I do think this is just really nice to kind of present it now, and then we can talk about the next steps and also see what would be useful for the sector in general, because I think we want to do stuff obviously for Dave's book, but in general getting like more data on this would be, I think, good for everyone. So what we would like to do in the future is do a bit more comparison with different art forms. So we looked a little bit at theatres. We might like to do it more with with others, and obviously with like a greater number. We do want to look beyond England, so that'll be something that I'm doing in the summer, and I think that we now have the data for that. And we want to do a member survey of the future art centres. So the things that we were like struggling to find in terms of audiences and artist numbers, and also stuff about working with young people. Hopefully, if people kind of, if they'd be happy to do another survey, we're going to try and put that together and maybe send it out towards the end of summer, I think, and just ask, for some, just to get a bit more like robust data. I think they have, 150 or so members. So that'd be good. I think that's everything for me. I have no conception of time or how it's quick or so that was. Thank you.
Well, I just dismantled my microphone as I was getting up. Sorry about that. Okay, let's see if that works. Hello, everyone. Nice to see some Future Art Centres members here. My name's Gavin Barlow. I'm co-director of Future. Can you hear me, by the way? Is this okay? Yeah, okay, cool. Co-director of Future Art Centres. And also till very recently, chief executive of an art centre, the Albany in Deptford, in South East London. And first of all, I guess, thank you to Dave and Ray. And I was struck, we're often asked about how do we define art centres, and it's quite slippery. But I think Dave's definitions were really strong and actually identified something very kind of unique and specific around what is great about art centres, or how they work, what they're trying to do, and what their impact and success is. And I think also identifying that there has been a kind of quiet renaissance of art centres over the last 15 to 20 years, which I think is really clear. But at the same time, and I think Dave did acknowledge this as well, I think a lot of theatres and other kind of single art form venues have become a lot more like art centres, have learned a lot from art centres, I would say, over the last 15 years, which is entirely a good thing. So Future Art Centres, I think people have mentioned different numbers. I think we're up to 170 members now across the UK, so it's growing all the time. It was formed in 2013, really just, as a support group, really, of leaders of art centres. And has grown out of that. It's still got kind of peer support at its core. but it's also focused on advocacy. There was a feeling at the time, as we've identified, that there wasn't really a voice for art centres, and people, they were undefined. I think, 20 years ago, people didn't claim the label art centre at all. They kind of tried to hide it a little bit. And I think that's, you can see that that's absolutely shifted in the last few years. And we're also there about leadership and organisational development. But I think, as well as being about art centres, we also see ourselves as with a mission for change in the art sector in general, trying to encourage all of the arts to become a little bit more art centre in the way that they work. And in terms of the data, I think it's interesting to compare and contrast. Thinking about our members, 40%, only 40% are NPOs or, well, across the UK, so equivalent of NPOs, so 60% aren't. However, 85% are funded by their local authority or are local authority owned, which has obviously made them really, there's a certain historical logic to that, but I think it's made them really, really vulnerable, because although we know central government funding has deteriorated for the arts, local government funding has pretty much collapsed across the country. So I would say that they've been in a much more vulnerable position than average for arts venues. Like Ray, we've also kind of done research over past times. We do a similar thing where we kind of do a scrape of data from all of the published annual reports that are on the Charities Commission website, which obviously has its own problems, but actually, as kind of creating a data set of over 100 art centres, is useful then to look at averages and to look at trends over a period of time. Obviously, we also kind of do other research, and we're going to do further research this year, specifically around some of the things that Ray mentioned. I think one of the things that will be particularly interesting is around that audience demographic. Obviously, it's kind of not, there's not kind of any kind of clear evidence at the moment. When we've done research in the past, it's actually shown that there is a different audience demographic, that art centres in general reach more of the less engaged, or people that are defined as less engaged than average. So it'd be interesting to look at that in more detail, but also looking at the data that doesn't show up. You mentioned kind of artists, but also all of that participation data and those different kinds of relationships that art centres have that don't necessarily all show up in audience data. But I guess to look at trends over the last few years, as with all arts venues, art centres have been struggling in the last few years. Most of them have been, the majority are and have been loss-making. Most of them have very little in the way of reserves, so don't have much of a kind of cash balance to kind of support them in difficulties. I think there's evidence in the last year that that's slightly stabilised, and I think that's because, not because more money is coming in, but because art centres have cut their activities, cut staff, and so essentially they've been adapting to the new realities and the balance, which I guess is positive in the sense that art centres are adapting, but actually the outputs and the impacts presumably are lower. And also, I think it still remains true that very, very many art centres are in an incredibly precarious state. The other trends are, you can clearly see local authority funding going down. You can also see trust and foundation funding going down, which I think supports kind of anecdotal evidence that it's getting harder and harder to fundraise through the ways that arts organisations usually do. In terms of business models, I think when we looked at comparing the theatres, I was a bit disappointed that they weren't vastly different. I was hoping for bigger differences there, but there are differences. Art centres are generally kind of earned income. Earning their own income is the majority of their turnover, and that's higher than average for arts organisations. Also, if you look at the diversity of that turnover, it's quite different. So if you look at the balance, if you look at the annual reports of most theatres, the majority of their earned income is ticket sales, as you would expect. If you look at the majority of art centres, it's the other way around. Ticket sales are important, but there's a diverse range of income from lots of different sources. Like to think that's kind of an entrepreneurial, flexible approach, but it speaks to all of the things that Dave was talking about those multi-entrance points, about thinking around, I suppose, being audience focused rather than art form focused, and thinking around all of those connections. So that same kind of diversity in terms of audience and relationships, I think reflects itself as a kind of diversity in business models as well. Just to touch, we've been doing some research with Arup around capital, and just to shift to capital funding, I think that's another absolutely key area. There's been chronic underinvestment in capital funding in the last 15 years. I think looking at it, like 80% of art centres have got urgent plans to do stuff, but can't do it. And 60% of them haven't had any kind of investment in their infrastructure, in their buildings in the last 10 years. So I think that's a kind of urgent issue. I'm sure Jen's going to address that as well. I suppose we've been talking a lot about funding, and I suppose one thing to say is, you know, I don't think things are going to shift massively anytime soon in terms of going back to levels of funding we might have seen 15 years ago. And I think it's important that we as venues at the same time are adapting, are rethinking what we do, how we do it, what we're for, and thinking about how we kind of develop our earned income as well. And I think, and this isn't an argument for not more funding, absolutely there should be, but that argument for funding, as difficult as it is, I don't think it can be for continuing to fund us as we are. It has to be for the impact that we can show, the delivery we can show, but also the potential that we can demonstrate for future impact as well. I think part of the hypothesis that was coming out in what Dave said, which hasn't been proven as yet, is a feeling that there is a disparity in funding between art centres and, say, other venues. And I think one of the starting points was to try and demonstrate that, which is partly demonstrated, but to demonstrate the value of art centres, and you're getting more bang for your buck and actually getting more diverse audiences, and you're getting so many more things than you would from the investment. And I think that's interesting to kind of follow that line and kind of see where that goes. I kind of sense that that's absolutely true, and we'll find ways to prove it. I think it's also probably interesting to look at the kind of historical basis of that disparity, which is something that hasn't been mentioned. I mean, my own sense is, and people that are Arts Council funded will know this, that when it comes up, when the funding rounds come up, there's a fixation on you can't, you're at this level, you can only increase by a small percentage, otherwise it will look wrong. And the kind of result of that is, of course there's change, there's new people coming on, but in terms of venues, you kind of feel that you're stuck in this historical, this history of where you were funded 15, 20 years ago. And I do think if we look back at that, and something I do want to do, I'm finishing off in a second, Dave, no worries. That if we look back at that, we'll find that the history of that is something to do with art centres being seen as receiving houses and not producing venues, and also maybe that kind of the quality aspect, which Dave was very keen to put right in terms of the perception of community art. So I think it would be interesting to trace that back through, and would be really interesting in terms of funding, instead of to be caught in that historical kind of version of it, is that we're actually really looking at the impact, the value and the potential of venues in terms of funding, because I think that would produce a kind of radical change in how the funding works. So at that point, I think I'm really Jen from the outset.
You won't Pandora's box there.
Touch on then. Hello, everyone.
You lost your microphone, Rachel.
Have I? Oh, hang on. Is that okay? Is that all right? Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Jen Cleary. I'm Director of Combined Arts and also North West for Arts Council England. My pronouns are she, her. I'm in my mid-40s with dark hair and a sort of textile jumpsuit on today. Really nice to be here, and thank you, Dave, for inviting me along. It's really nice to share this panel discussion with Gavin and Rachel. So Gavin's just delivered his response entirely without using notes, which is really frustrating. But I probably am going to run through. I probably am going to run through some notes, and there's a lot to kind of touch on there, isn't there? But I guess just first up, I think I'll just echo Dave in terms of kind of my passion for art centres and kind of the role that they can play in artist development, in community support and development, in convening communities and in placemaking. I think art centres have a really, really vital role to play. I think just to kind of pick up on some of the contextual things that you were talking about, Gavin, I think, you know, clearly we're living in a world and a funding environment which is quite volatile. There's a changing world, kind of economically, socially, politically. And I think as a kind of broad sector, the cultural sector is really resilient and adaptable with really strong leadership. And, you know, you talked about that kind of flexibility in terms of responding to the funding environment, but also the impact that that has on activity and energy levels and, you know, leadership. And so I think we really recognise that. I think in that context, it is just really important that we're all constantly kind of making the case for culture and for the impact that culture can have on communities. So there was a CBA report that was published last week, which really talked about the level of investment of sort of 0.01% of taxpayers' funding that goes into culture, but what a mighty punch actually that investment makes. And I think it's important that we kind of continue to talk about the positive role that creativity and culture have on society, and but also in kind of UK PLC and in the development of creative talent and the way that the kind of broad cultural infrastructure, art centres, theatres and many other organisations contribute towards the development of talent and how our country kind of operates in it. So that, I think that's just a kind of an initial point about the kind of context. I think within that context, art centres can make a really strong case for culture. The art centres that we're supporting in, I think, you know, universally are artistically ambitious, collaborative, inclusive, dynamic cultural organisations. And it's really hard to kind of define what an art centre is, and we'll come on to the data question in a minute, but you know, some of those commonalities that Dave mentioned: venues-based, multi-art form programmes, socially minded, but it's also a really diverse set of cultural organisations and business models and contexts that art centres are operating in, from the kind of largest parts of our portfolio, like the South Bank Centre, kind of operating in an urban environment with international, multidisciplinary kind of programmes open all year round, lots of different kind of sources of income, to, you know, on a very different scale, somewhere like Rose Hill in Whitehaven in Cumbria, which is a real anchor creative cultural organisation for its community, but operating in a completely different context, but no less innovative or dynamic, I think, in the way that it is bringing the cultural sector together, the way that it is facilitating an open invitation for communities to come and be involved, to exercise their own creativity and to experience new and high quality artwork. So, you know, a couple of the works that Rose Hill delivers, for example, at the same time, they're doing workshops which are around singing for joy. And frankly, I'll hold my hands up, what more exciting than just doing some singing for joy and Welsh, you know, that's part of my kind of cultural heritage. But also Whitehaven Harbour Fest, where they're bringing really extraordinary outdoor artists to kind of come and bring the community together and showcase really high quality artistic work on the doorstep. And then there's many, many more art centres kind of in between that, but whether large or small scale, I think, you know, they're acting as conveners in local communities. And increasingly, I think, or perhaps more visibly, developing really strong cross-sectoral relationships with health, with education, with kind of social justice, and kind of looking at how to leverage new partnerships and additional funding through those sorts of ways. And I think across the Arts Centre's portfolio that we support, we can see really, really strong engagement for young people. Z Arts, Blue Coat, you know, lots of organisations here, really offering really best practice creative provisions for young people and families, but also collaborating really innovatively in how that is developed, commissioned, and kind of progressed. So I guess just in terms of our Arts Centre investment, I think it is different. We were talking about this when I first arrived, kind of looking at the data, and I think we can provide hopefully a more rich data set to look at to interrogate this as part of the next stage of the research. But part of the kind of complexity of it is how we classify art centres, how we define them, but also how we can pull that data out. So just a sort of slightly boring but technical point. You know, we can pull art centre data either by art centres as a name, but of course that would exclude things like UK Story House, Home, South Bank Centre. We can pull it via art centre in the project title, but again that would exclude vast amounts. We can pull it via the venue identifier as an art centre as a venue identifier. I think when we start to do that, and I say this with a pinch of salt, I've not properly looked at the data yet. I've only got back from holiday and had a look at it, but that kind of indicates that we're supporting around 290 or so different arts centre organisations through the NPO. Now, I'm not sure that that's right actually, and I think that needs a real kind of interrogation to look at what's captured within that. But it does suggest a kind of a greater investment than we might initially kind of envisage. I think there's also kind of beyond the national portfolio, there are other ways that the investment is being input. So you mentioned capital funding, and I think, you know, that sense of art centres, really that sort of need for capital investment in art centres to come up to date is urgent, and I think the research that you've done with ARP is really important in that. And hopefully, you know, there will be opportunities to address that. I think last year we put back 7 million of capital investment into 19 different art centres across the country. But earlier this year, the government also announced an £85 million capital fund to support investment in infrastructure. And whilst we're working through the details of kind of what that looks like with DCMS, that may provide an opportunity for art centres to kind of build in for support through that. I think in the last portfolio, we were able to increase our investment in art centres. I think because they align quite strongly to the Let's Create strategy, which has three outcomes. One is around creative people, so about how arts organisations can have an open invitation and for people to come and express their own creative potential and to develop their own creative potential. And I think art centres respond really strongly to that outcome. The second is around cultural communities and around how art centres are anchors, conveners, play a really critical role in placemaking and in understanding need and responding to need and programming in response to audiences, and also being really supportive of the artistic point of view. And again, I think, you know, the art centres throughout the portfolio really respond well to that. But the third is a creative and cultural country, and that is all about the professional artistic development sector. And I think that the position that art centres occupy in terms of artistic talent development, in terms of supporting innovative artistic ambition and collaboration, is perhaps sometimes under-profiled. And I think it's a really, really important part of the work that art centres do.
Final points if you can do.
Yes, I think it was really great to be able to invest in future art centres as an investment organisation for art centres, and to do that work actually of convening and to look at trends and to kind of, you know, survey and pull together and that work that you've been doing around most significant change. which I think gives, art sectors collectively a really strong voice and a really strong sort of understanding of what the commonalities, the differences and the opportunities are.
Great, thanks, Jen. So, because of time, I'm going to ask the panel one question, and then I'm going to open up to the floor. So if you've got questions, if you stick hand up. Do we need to do a roving mic there? Yeah, we've got a roving mic. Because this is being recorded, so it can be shared later, sometimes. So, when I first started my honorary fellowship, I was really excited because I was like a kid in a sweet shop in the library, because the library at this university is just extraordinary. And I thought that when I started Googling, searching the library, I'd find loads of research papers on art centres. I was wrong. The art centres are touched on a bit. So do you think the fact that art centres are so under-researched, that's indicative of the way that they're valued, even by the academic sector? Panel. Loads of papers on theatres, loads of papers on galleries, museums, art centres.
Well, yes, I guess is the answer, but
Bit of a leading question.
it's interesting how little there is. Like, I would have predicted there would be less, but it's incredible that there's so little, even over quite a long period of time.
My library Google skills might not be as good as anybody, but no, this is remarkable. Look, has the Arts Council commissioned much in the past, Jen? And this is not intended to be confrontational.
No, not that I'm aware of. But I think, I think the work that you're doing, I think the complexity of what we've just been talking about, and I think also the way that art centres have maybe shifted in terms of definition and the kind of the emphasis now on kind of placemaking. I think it's really timely to do the research now and to really look at what the context is now and what the opportunities are going forward. So,
I mean, part of the challenge is I'm not an academic, and some of it's going to be opinion, etc. So I'm trying to navigate that space is going to be quite interesting. So if people have got pearls of wisdom to throw my way. But I'm open to the floor now. Does anybody have any questions? It's always the person at the back first, isn't it?
Thank you. My name is Roddy Hawkins. I'm an academic and music historian. So touching on the point you were just making there, I'm interested in this kind of historic distinction between amateur and professional practice, between amateur and professional space. And I'm wondering if the panel feel that the amateur professional binary continues to be a helpful one for understanding the sorts of things that you've been discussing and for understanding the nature of the art centre today.
Great question, thank you. Who wants to jump in first? I don't think it's helpful. I've worked in a community setting all my professional life virtually, and I've seen some absolutely first-rate art made by amateurs. Who, I mean, the distinction is not whether they're artists or not, it's whether they get paid for it. And I think that's the distinction. I don't think it's helpful. Every year, in where I live, around the Tameside in Oldham, there is a Whit Friday band contest, and you'll see some of the best amateur musicians of here anywhere playing music in those places for free. And I defy anybody to tell me they're not a professional standard. It's just extraordinary. And that goes for all sorts of other views as well. I don't think it's helpful, but I think that the way that the Arts Council was originally conceived was all about circling the wagons to make sure that the privileged got access to the money. And it's not the current Arts Council's fault, it's not them, but that's basically what it was about. And that's been, it was a small window when the National Lottery was open for, brass bands again got a lot of uniforms, usage and instruments. They don't get them now because the lottery's been, really reducing its funding. So, By the way, that's not the opinion of Manchester City Council.
And I think, I guess, thinking from the outside perspective, you know, I think what we're interested is quality and ambition, and I think that works across all sorts of different types of artistic practice. And I think, you know, we are interested in wherever you live and whatever your background, being able to access really high quality artistic experiences and be involved in creating high quality artistic work that resonates with you and that responds to the things that kind of matter to you, that you know, help to kind of enrich your life and your society and your community. And I think, you know, those are things that we're interested in. Our investment principles are around ambition and quality, and that you know, that works across all of those different elements of practice.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, so I won't kind of go on a little bit, but it feels like it's a really, I mean, it's a similar debate between kind of quality and access, and you kind of start to see that playing out now as if they're two things, you know, that are mutually exclusive. You can't have this spectrum of quality working across all sorts of different things. And I do think that's where art centres are kind of interestingly coming through the middle in a little sense, and there's always been, if you like, an open-mindedness to kind of, you know, working with people where they are and developing creativity, creative potential of people and of a place. Interestingly, I think, you know, when you look back historically, in a sense, art centres, in terms of their basic values, don't seem to have changed that much. There's been times when they've been deeply unfashionable, and maybe they're also having a moment now. But I think that they also do change because they adapt to the world as it is now, because they are, you know, at the base of what they do, responsive. So responding to communities and places they are now, but with values that I think have been kind of, you could look back to the 70s and 80s and see similar values.
One final point that before we go to the next question, and that is one of the things I've been talking to art centre leaders about is their origin stories, and there are actually three different sort of tracks which are quite interesting. There are art centres that have been established by artists, there are art centres that have been established by local authorities, the city, and there are art centres being established by communities, and many of them have got a different journey. They share common characteristics, but actually they are qualitatively different in the way that they currently exist as well, because of the way that they were rooted in their origin story. And I'm hoping to find out more about that as the research continues. There's another question.
Hi, my name's Lisa Driver. I'm an independent consultant with a small business called Stop Pigeon, which I started incidentally after leaving Contact, having worked there with Gavin and John McGrath. And for those of us who do passionately have access and inclusion in running through our blood and bones, which we do, it's a very complex question that you're posing, Dave, for your book, and it's really, really fantastic that you're doing this, because it's like, you know, you're sort of looking at the future of art centres and the future of placemaking. And if we take Manchester as an example, the disparity between the likes of investment that goes into some of the major cultural organisations and the investment that goes into, say, a community or art centre in Cheetham Hill is wildly different. And I went to see the film the other night at Contact about the start of the Nello James Centre in Whalley Range, which was phenomenal for that community. And I suppose my question is about investment relating to the local and the global issues around placemaking and how that balance is distributed, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's a huge question, Lisa. I think that certainly my research might throw up some conversations, but whether I'll be able to answer that or not, I don't know. It was interesting that I was originally, when I proposed the book, the publishers. I was looking at art centres globally, and it took a very short time for the person who wrote it to say, no, you're not. But I am looking at what's going on in Ireland, and as a comparator. And I haven't fully researched Ireland. John actually gave me some great contacts in Ireland to be able to have a look. But there's a really interesting dynamic going on there about the importance of art centres to place particularly that comes out of the pandemic. So there is a boom in art centre development in the Republic of Ireland, and it's a boom that's been driven by local authorities who, during the pandemic, realised how useful art centres were. And as a result of that, they are really pushing Arts Council Ireland to invest more, as well as local authorities. And I think that sort of speaks to the challenge that you're throwing my way around that local investment. The other thing is that I also, this is purely anecdotal, but in the research that I've done so far, I see there's a lot of, Ireland feels like a much more outward looking place than where I sit in England at the moment, in terms of its look to international being of local interest, but that's just an anecdotal feeling that I've got. I can't, whether I'll be able to answer that or not, I don't know. So I don't think I've answered your question, but I'll maybe comment on it. Anybody else want to join in that?
I mean, sorry, come on, Jen, I can get you.
I think it's a really complex question. I think it'll be one of the ways kind of explore a bit more through the research. I think for me there has to be space for both, and for it to be able to have really substantial flagship kind of investments that really draw kind of international attention, that are very visible or high profile. I think there's a lot of kind of value in that, alongside really impactful work that is working hyper locally. And I think there has to be a dialogue between the whole of the sector within a place, so that that the really, where there's really substantial bits of investment and substantial bits of other investment that's been leveraged in. So you look at sponsorship income that came in around the Studios, for example, incredible sum kind of support for cultural activity. But I think there needs to be a dialogue between all of it in place, so that it's really having the impact and maximising the potential that investment can have on people's lives.
Have another question? Yes. Yes. Okay. The gentleman in the back there.
Hi there, Dan from Barnsley Civic over there. Just a couple of, one thing I think we haven't talked about is the physical context, because I think a lot of us who run art centres, we're in charge of buildings, often heritage assets, and that's something we're not talked about a lot. And I think there's, I mean, me and Gavin spoken about this, there's opportunities there as well for art centres as both guardians of physical and social history. And I think there's something there about the fact that we often run the most significant civic buildings, and that we run as very porous buildings that people can come and dwell in without having to spend money. I think there's something important about that. I did want to just, by the way, the audience agency cohort is totally skewed. That is not the cohort, because it's all the big boys and doesn't represent us. Let's create, I don't want to put it on the spot, but I feel like art centres, you slightly understated it, art centres are what they do, and what they are is the heart of Let's Create. And when that started, there should have been a real step change in the way in which who was funded and what they were funded. And do you think the Arts Council followed through on the logic of Let's Create? Because I think if they had, there'd be a lot more money, a lot more investment in art centres than we see in the overall portfolio.
Yeah. So actually, I think the Arts Council is following through. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think if you look at kind of the data and the difference that was made in this first portfolio as part of this new strategy, vastly increased investment in areas that have historically had underrepresented underinvestment. And increased investment in really high quality organisations, yes, in art centres, and uplifting art centres that fell into the categories of underinvested in geographies or underinvested in communities. But also lots of other organisations, so outdoor art festivals, so galleries, libraries, museums, and one of the challenging jobs that the Arts Council has is that we've got to invest in the ecology as a whole. So yes, I do think there was increased investment in art centres. Yes, I think there's loads more potential to invest more, and that's why I kind of come back to that first point that I made, which is about collectively, if we really believe in the power and the impact of art centres, we've got to get better at making the case and kind of really telling the story about what difference that they make collaboratively together and the positive impact of investment public funds into culture.
To speak to your question about buildings, it is in there, probably didn't actually articulate it very well. Peter Stark is 6 conditions for an art centre from the book, from that book there. I think it's a good indication of what one of the things I'm finding. So art centres should be involved in participation, presenting work, seeing some present work, but sociability, they're a social space. All of the art centres I've spoken to so far are open much longer hours than straightforward art centres. There are places that people go to hang out. And they're also really interested in safe spaces. So when I went to the Arc in Stockton 2 weeks ago, I parked in the car park. There were 2 people shooting up the car park outside. And that opposite the venue that young people go to because they feel safe in there to make art. That showed me really, obviously, they were doing some really good stuff in there, but it was the right atmosphere for that place, and very important work. Resource centre, a place that's got resources to enable people to do stuff. Young people, Pixar talks about, and then finally a place for the artists where the artists can make and interact, etc. So I think as places, they're fundamentally important, and then their impact on the place is a separate thing. And I don't want to conjoin those 2 things, although they are related. But it is interesting. There are some buildings that have been opened as art centres that just didn't work, and there are others that did. And whether any consistent factors come up, I don't know. Is that another one? No, don't know.
No, just on the data question, yeah, you're totally right that buildings and it's big for the first food. And that's why it's a nice thing to finish on. It's nice that we're here, and if you want to like help and like kind of get involved, please do. Because it'd be really great to to work with you and make sure that you're represented in it.
And thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to just, before I'm going to step in, just to thank Dave and Ray, an excellent researcher, just issued a call to you. And so we'll have a contact point. And as Dave said, this is the first. We hope we'll be able to return with more data and more analysis as well, for us to start thinking together more about the future of art centres. So maybe if you can join me in thanking Gavin, Jen, Ray and Dave for talking to us today.